Don't you think it's kind of offensive to say to me that I'm not an atheist when I am?
You have a religious substructure, whether you know it or not.
Jordan Peterson has left thousands of people confused and or upset with his statements that most atheists are not actually atheists according to their actions. In this video, we are going to voyage through a series of clips and book quotations in an attempt to explain and discover a fair portion of where Peterson is coming from in making those kinds of statements. Before diving in, however, you must know that most of the time Peterson talks about God, he's not talking theology or metaphysics such as philosophers and theologians do. Rather, he's generally talking about the psychological function of the mere concept of God, regardless of any metaphysical truth. Lastly, you must understand this. You need to act, or else you die.
You can't act without a hierarchy of values, because you can't act unless you think one thing is better than another. Because why would you act otherwise? So that means that you're embedded within a hierarchy of values.
Going step by step, action is necessarily predicated upon implicit hierarchies of value.
You're embedded within a hierarchy of values, whether you know it or not, or maybe multiple fragmentary and competing hierarchies of value, which is all the worse for you, by the way, because it just makes you very confused.
These hierarchies guide our behavior. However, you might have multiple and competing hierarchies of value.
The psychoanalytic theories are something like, you're a loose collection of living subpersonalities, each with its own set of motivations and perceptions and emotions and rationales, all of that. And you have limited control over that. So you're like a plurality of internal personalities that's loosely linked into a unity. You know that because you can't control yourself very well.
In brief, you're a collective plurality of loosely linked subpersonalities.
You know, the cognitive psychologists think about them in some sense as computational machines. And the ancient people, I think, thought of them as gods, although it's more complex than that. Like rage would be a god. Mars, the god of rage, that's the thing that possesses you when you're angry. You know, it has a viewpoint and it says what it wants to say, and that might have very little to do with what you want to say when you're being sensible. And it doesn't just inhabit you, it inhabits everyone, and it lives forever, and it even inhabits animals. And so it's this transcendent psychological entity.
5. In antiquity, these subpersonalities were often conceived of as gods.
One of the goals of life is to integrate all of that plurality into a hierarchical ethical structure that has some canonical ethic at the pinnacle.
These various subpersonalities, or gods, need to be hierarchically organized and unified by a sovereign principle at the top.
You know, the other thing that Jung was very insistent upon was that there was a relationship between polytheism and psychological confusion, and monotheism and psychological unification.
In Maps of Meaning, Peterson says, I learned from Iliade how to make sense out of the notion of a heavenly hierarchy. The monotheism of Judaism and Christianity has its roots in older, more polytheistic thinking. The many gods of archaic conceptualization became the single ruler of more modern religious thinking as a consequence of spiritual competition, so to speak. This competition is the battle of ideas with implication for action, fought in abstraction, image, and in the course of genuine earthly combat, portrayed in mythology as spiritual war, played out in heaven, which is the place where transpersonal ideas exist. The deity who came to prevail over all is one God, with a complex set of attributes, surrounded by a panoply of angels and divine echoes of previous gods, who represent those transpersonal and eternal psychological processes rendered subordinate in the course of the spiritual phylogenesis of man.
And so all of that interior struggling that you're doing is an attempt to bang yourself against the world with challenge constantly, to hit everything together like you're beating on a piece of iron to cure it, let's say, so that you're not an internal contradiction, you're not a massive competing god, something like that, because it's just too psychologically stressful and hard on everyone else and impossible for them to get along with you if you're one thing one moment and another thing another moment.
7. Without a unifying sovereign principle atop your hierarchy of value, you remain in a state of psychological confusion. Mythologically, an internal polytheistic state of warring gods. In the earliest stages of representation, deities are viewed as pluralistic, and as individualistic and fractitious members of a supercelestial, that is, transpersonal and immortal, community. Later, they are integrated into a hierarchy. As the culture becomes more integrated, more sure about relative valuation and moral virtue, and a single God, with a multitude of related features, comes to dominate. Development of monotheism thus parallels intrapsychic and intracultural moral integration. As the average citizen identifies more and more clearly with this monotheistic, integrated pattern, its external nature, as an attribute of the gods, recedes. It becomes more clearly an attribute of the human being, per se, rather than a characteristic of the extra-individual world, and more like what we would conceive of as a psychological trait.
It seems that if you analyze the history of the development of monotheistic ideas, that monotheism emerges out of a plurality of gods. And as I mentioned, I think it's because the gods represent fundamental forces at minimum, and those fundamental forces have to be hierarchically organized with something absolute at the top, because otherwise they do nothing but war, right? You have to organize your values hierarchically or you stay confused. And that's true if you're an individual, and it's true if you're a state. If you don't know what the next thing you should do is, then there's 50 things you should do, and then how are you going to do any of them? You can't. You have to prioritize. Something has to be above something else. It has to be arranged in a hierarchy for it not to be chaotic. And so there's some principle at the top of the hierarchy, and maybe the organization of the gods over time. That's the battle of gods that Mircea Eliade talked about.
8. Intrapsychic development, from polytheistic confusion to monotheistic unification, mirrors the same development intraculturally. The ever-expanding human capacity for abstraction, central to human consciousness, has enabled us to produce self-models sufficiently complex and extended to take into account the temporal boundaries of individual life. These complex systems of action and belief are religious. They comprise the traditional means of dealing with the shadow cast on life by knowledge of mortality. More on the second half of this in a moment. 9. Humanity abstracts values and ideals to serve as guides for patterns of action.
And it really looks like, in some sense, that's how monotheism emerged out of polytheism, is that the tribal groups had their local ideals, let's say, and then when they came together, those local ideals were amalgamated into what you might describe as a meta-ideal, and people were able to unite under that meta-ideal.
According to Mircea Eliade, the mutual identification of all the gods ends in a monotheism of the syncretistic type. The gods of a tribe represented those tribes' ideals and values, and through tribal interaction, those gods eventually amalgamated into one supreme god, representing all of those values and ideals that were non-conflicting.
Well, so the question is, think about it. We're in these hierarchies, many of them across centuries. We're trying to figure out what the guiding principle is. We're trying to extract out the core of the guiding principle, and we turn that into a representation of a pattern of being. Well, it's something like that. That's God. It's an abstracted ideal.
So God, if nothing else, represents an abstracted ideal to guide our behavior. And theologically speaking, that is fairly accurate. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, etc. And according to St. Anselm of Canterbury, a medieval Catholic monk, God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. And in the Christian tradition, Christians seek to be imitators of Christ, who is God in the flesh.
And so Jung's point was whatever sits at the pinnacle of your value structure serves the function of God.
To quote Jung, he says, psychologically speaking, God always denotes the highest value. He goes on to say that as the eye to the sun, so the soul responds to God. The soul must contain in itself the faculty of relationship to God, that is, a correspondence, otherwise a connection could never come about. This correspondence is, in psychological terms, the archetype of the God image. In that matter, there are no atheists. There are only people who know, and don't know, what God they serve.
Carl Jung said people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. You have a hierarchy of values. Whatever is at the top of that hierarchy of values serves the function of God for you. Now, it may be a God that you don't believe in or a God that you can't name, but it doesn't matter because it's God for you. And what you think about God has very little impact on how God is acting within you, whatever God it is that you happen to be, let's say, following.
So whatever sits atop your hierarchy of value is functionally equivalent to your God, because it reigns sovereign over all other things in your life and is the primary guide for your behavior. So in that sense, there are no atheists.
Are you saying that no one is really an atheist deep down?
I didn't say no one was.
Okay.
I said that most of the people who claim to be atheists aren't. Well, one of the things that's always bothered me about the new atheist types, and the hyper-rationalists is that they're, as far as I can tell, their conduct is full of performative contradictions. They say they believe certain things, but they don't act that way.
And I think that that's the fundamental hallmark of belief, is it's how you act, not what you say about what you think you think.
Sure.
What do you know about what you think? See, there's a difference between thinking something and believing it, because to believe it, it has to be thought incarnated in some sense. It has to be embodied.
We're not transparent to ourselves at all. That's why we have to go to university and study psychology. It's like, we're not exactly black boxes, but we are the most complicated things there are, right? And we can't even program our VCR clocks. So it's like, how the hell can we propose to understand ourselves? Religious is what you act out.
Anything you act out.
Everything you act out is predicated on your implicit axioms. And the system of implicit axioms that you hold as primary is your religious belief system. It doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or not. That's just surface noise.
Peterson argues from the lesser to the greater that we are enormously complicated and not at all transparent to ourselves. As such, our actions reveal our implicit axiomatic structure much more reliably than our explicit articulations of that axiomatic structure. The world can be validly construed as a forum for action or as a place of things. The former manner of interpretation, more primordial and less clearly understood, finds its expression in the arts or humanities, in ritual, drama, literature, and mythology. The world as a forum for action is a place of value, a place where all things have meaning. This meaning, which is shaped as a consequence of social interaction, is implication for action, or, at a higher level of analysis, implication for the configuration of the interpretive schema that produces or guides action. The latter manner of interpretation, the world as a place of things, finds its formal expression in the methods and theories of science. No complete world picture can be generated without use of both modes of construal.
Religious propositions are, in some sense, abstracted generalizations about what being consists of and how to act in it. Because in the religious domain, the moral imperative is primary. So the question from the religious perspective is something like, how should we best construe the world if we wish to determine how to act properly within it?
14. According to Peterson, religion is primarily concerned with value and how to act in the world. So your primary system of axioms in your value structure, which guide your behavior, is equivalent to your religious substructure.
That was the danger that both Nietzsche and Dostoevsky pointed to clearly. It's like you dispense with the transcendent principle and you open up the landscape for impulsive nihilism.
The dissolution of the king means that much of what was previously understood reverts to the unknown. This might be regarded as the reversal of the historical process that made of all gods one supreme god, or, speaking more psychologically, as the war of conflicting drives, desires, and subpersonalities that ensues when an overarching hierarchy of values has collapsed. Such a reversion places the individual in a state characterized by great uncertainty, frustration, depression, and turmoil. Without that sovereign god atop your hierarchy of value, you revert back to that internal chaotic polytheistic state of warring gods, highly vulnerable to impulsivity, uncertainty, nihilism, and inner turmoil.
That's really worth thinking about, right? Because religion collapses and what happens is nationalism just rises up to take its place. Because you need a bloody belief structure, because what else, what are you going to do? Wander around aimlessly? That's not fun. It's not useless or useful, So you just jump from one structure of belief to another, or you fall apart. So
even if you eradicate the traditional trappings of a mythological worldview, which seems to be what's happened as a consequence of our rise in empirical knowledge, that you don't eradicate the tendency for people to formulate groups, belief systems, around conceptions of ways that you should behave that are, at the very least, religious in structure and action, even if they're not religious in name.
Since action is necessarily predicated upon structures of value and belief, even if you eradicate a traditionally religious belief structure, another belief structure will rush in to fill the gap.
Then the eradication of a system like that leaves a vacuum. And then the question is, what rushes in to fill a vacuum? Well, if you look at the case of the Soviet Union, it seems quite instructive, doesn't it? I mean, there's a 30-year period where there's tremendous intellectual clash, say, between a materialist and empirical perspective. And in a Russian Orthodox perspective, the Russian Orthodox perspective loses its attractiveness for the reigning intellectual elite, and the presuppositions of communism, which appear rational by contrast, but which by all evidence were not, rush in to fill the gap.
The eradication of a successful and complete belief structure leaves both individuals and societies vulnerable to destructive ideological possession. The dissolution of a belief structure leaves one sinking in an ocean of chaotic uncertainty. In this state, totalitarian belief structures that offer certainty become attractive because even a broken ship is preferable to drowning.
For the best of all possible things to happen, and in this case it's that a true individual is born, it's necessary to start by establishing a relationship with something that's transcendent.
So that's an echo of the idea that we encountered earlier about walking with God, right? So Adam walked with God before he ate the fruit with Eve, and then he wouldn't walk with God. And then Noah walked with God, and Abraham walked with God. And so the idea is, well, that's that alignment with the highest ideal. I think it's something like that.
So, concludingly, the best way to act in the world is by first establishing and aligning a relationship with the highest ideal. And that's a bit like the idea of walking with God. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share it, and comment down below. Let me know what you thought. Appreciate it. Peace.